All right, so now we get into the real part of the matter. We're going to look at the actual problems, alleged problems with the death penalty one by one. You can open up your second PowerPoint slideshow on your As You Learn page under the alleged problems part of the course, okay? And we'll go through them one by one and hit some of the main points. This video will be longer than the last one because there's a lot of information here, and we certainly can't go through it all, but I'll hit some of the main points. The first issue is financial costs. Now, you might not think financial costs matter if you're interested in justice only, but if you believe that costs matter because there might be a cheaper alternative, then it becomes an issue. As a general rule, the death penalty is more expensive than life imprisonment. That seems unbelievable, right? It's illogical. Dr. Bohm, who I mentioned before in the previous video, says it's 2 to 5 times more expensive than life without parole. We'll see similar numbers coming out of North Carolina when we look at those studies as well. On slide number 3, you'll see some examples from state after state after state. 1.5 million more, 1 million more, 500,000 more. California is 12 times more expensive for the death penalty than life. This goes on and on and on, okay? And you can look at the cost studies on the death penalty information website. Now, North Carolina's study was considered the most comprehensive death penalty study in the country on cost. The total cost per execution was $2.16 million more than life in imprisonment. Now, this is from 1993, so things may have changed. There are some other studies summarized in the report that I wrote, so this is linked in your PowerPoint slideshow as well. The study that I wrote about the death penalty in North Carolina actually goes through the details of the studies really thoroughly, and you'll see that, yeah, the death penalty costs more. Here's why, okay? The investigation costs more, the trial costs more, prosecution costs more, the cell costs more, the defense costs more, especially so this is a state expense if they're on they don't have private attorneys, which most of them don't because they're generally poor. That's another issue. Then the appeals are enormously expensive. This is why it costs so much, okay? Now, I've added some other costs that we've seen across the country. We don't see many studies like this anymore. That's why they're somewhat dated. But the other costing is what are called opportunity costs. Opportunity costs are money you can't spend on other things because you're spending it on this. So there are things we can't buy or fix or whatever because we're spending money on the death penalty. This includes defense attorneys, highways, police, more taxes, cuts to indigent care, libraries, no employee raises, cuts to officers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, okay? So the death penalty costs governments a lot of money. And when you wrote the assignment about why states have started to abolish the death penalty, that's one of the issues that they talk about is cost. They're using that money for other things, okay? Delays in pay raises, smaller pay raises, layoffs, cuts to equipment, delays in other prosecutions because all the resources are going to the death penalty case, cuts to higher education, healthcare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, okay? These are the costs of the death penalty. Now, that may or may not be relevant to you. It doesn't mean you have to oppose the death penalty because it costs more, right? But it does cost more. The next issue is more problematic and should make you think about whether we should continue to do this. Arbitrariness and discrimination. What I want you to know is the death penalty as applied is inevitably arbitrary. That means it will necessarily be arbitrary. Why? It's not mandatory, right? So it's rare. It's decided by the discretion of prosecutors. States, under federalist government like ours, states are allowed to do what they want within reason, right? As long as their laws don't violate the Constitution or they're not a violation of the 5th and 14th Amendments, that sort of thing, then you're going to have randomness. You're going to have arbitrariness. You also have prejudices in the population. We can acknowledge that. Courtroom work groups that are not representative. So 95% of prosecutors are white. So, you're going to logically, white prosecutors might empathize more with white victims, just as an example. Where we see arbitrariness is in the disparity. Disparity means different. It doesn't mean discrimination. But we see differences based on extra legal factors like gender, class, or race. That's where we see evidence of arbitrariness. And it's always been that way, okay? So the first one is social class. And the first thing I always talk about, and I talk about this in all my classes, you don't hear about in other classes. The first source of class bias comes from the law, because the law is made by white old rich men, who I've termed worms in my literature, okay, in my writing. But worms, white old rich men, are the ones that decide what acts of killing are murder and which are not. Okay, so we know that the things we call murder, the types of killings we call murder, are generally committed by less well-off people. And the types of killings that are committed by well-off people don't get considered murder. That's sort of beyond our class, but that's what we know. But we also know the vast majority of death row inmates were represented by public defenders, which means they could not provide money for their own defense, which means they were poor. So that means death row is filled up with poor people. Now, in the survey that I did of the experts, when I asked them, is American capital punishment plagued by social class bias of any kind? These are people that teach and write about the death penalty for a living. 80% said the death penalty is plagued by a social class problem. Okay, you can read their answers if you're interested. The entire justice system is plagued by social class bias. It permeates the decision making of the entire criminal justice system. This is what two different experts said. Absolutely, you look at any death row and this becomes immediately apparent. In other words, it's filled with poor people, right? Next expert, most of all death row inmates are from the lower class. Okay. The studies demonstrate class bias. The effects of social class permeate all of society. That's an interesting argument. The poor cannot afford good legal representation. The next expert says the poor cannot afford defense attorneys. Another expert says one of the biggest problems are class differences in legal representation. So you see some pretty clear consistency in the experts in terms of what they think. Not enough money to mount an effective defense. See, these are all the experts saying basically the same thing in different words, right? Here's some funnier stuff. One expert said, the aphorism, capital punishment, them that don't have the capital get the punishment, is true. Another said, those without capital get the punishment. And I like this one. To paraphrase a wise observation, the criminal justice system knows who pays for it, and no place in the world are they the poor. These are experts trying to explain the class bias. Others said, no, because upper class persons rarely engage in violent crimes. But we know that's not true, because upper class people are the ones that manufacture defective products, employ people in hazardous workplaces. This is some of the stereotypes of crime, right? Wealthy persons do not commit robbery, murders, or killings of police officers. That's true. They commit other forms of theft and assault, right? That's beyond our class. So I'll give you some examples of how they kill in terms of tobacco, fatty foods, hospital air, occupational diseases, defective products. A little beyond our class, but the point is we don't go after these people, even when they're culpable, even when they're legally culpable for these acts, we don't go after them. That's because of the law. So that's the first bias, okay? Others were unsure, that they said they're not sure that it's a plague or whatever. Now, we look at race and ethnicity. You look at, first of all, the makeup of death row. Overall, 42% black, okay. Federal, 44%, military, 60%, North Carolina, 55%. You might say, well, if black people make up 13% of the population, how can they make up 42% of the death row population, right? Well, that's because African Americans actually commit way more murder than white people. That's good news that the law is what explains these disparities as opposed to racism. It's not fun or cool to see death rows filled with African Americans, but as you'll see when you go through this unit, African Americans are actually less likely to be sentenced to death than white people because of who they kill. There's a race of victim bias that prioritizes white victims or celebrates white victims, or it's tougher on murderers of white victims, especially when the murderer is not white. So here's some data to explain this. It's if you open the slideshow, it's slide number 22. A lot of numbers there, but white people make up 45% of murder convictions, but 58% of executions. African Americans make up 51% of murder convictions, but 34% of executions. Okay. Now these are not same date, same years and everything. I get that, but the point is, white people will get sentenced to death more than black people, and that's because of who they kill. That's what the research shows. Now, when I asked the experts, is American capital punishment plagued by a racial bias of any kind? 84% said yes. 84%. Here's what some of them said. Appears to discriminate on the basis of race of victim. Studies show racial bias, especially race of victim, persists. Empirical evidence indicates the race of victim has a strong effect. These are different experts saying the same thing. Okay. There's very little evidence of race of defendant, but a lot of evidence of race of victim discrimination. Another one, race of victim still controls how bad the defendant's moral merit is seen to be. Killing a white person is seen as more bad. Here's the next expert. Although race of defendant literature is waning, race of victim literature points to reverence for white victims. Okay. We go after killers of whites. This is the bias we see. Another one says, there is not doubt. I think the primary racial bias comes in when we look at the race of victim. Okay. Here's the next one. Clear and convincing evidence of a strong race of victim effect. Every one of these is a different expert who studies this for a living. Okay. The evidence I'm aware of convinces me that the race of victim does play a role. Okay. Then it starts to get more specific. Those of color who kill a white female are most likely to be put to death. So you take a white female killed by a black man, for example, those are the ones that are most likely to lead to a death sentence. This is not a long answer, but they say, this expert says, most of the research suggests little race of defendant disparity, but race of victim disparity continues. Okay. Some experts are being smart. I regard this question as irrelevant to capital punishment since it's true of the entire criminal justice system. Here's another one. Racial bias is deeply embedded in most aspects of the criminal justice system. So of course it's going to be in the death penalty. Okay. There's others who say, well, maybe it exists somewhere and the race of victim effect is not proven to be caused by racial discrimination, etc. It has more to do with social class than race. So I've given you some more data on slide number 35 in this PowerPoint slideshow. And you look at, and it says convictions for murder 2006, but these are all 2016 data. So African Americans made up 51% of people convicted of murder, but only 34% of people executed. Okay. 46% whites made up 46% of people convicted of murder, but only 57%, but 57% of execution. So we're talking about using the death penalty predominantly for people who kill white people, and that's white people. So yes, there's interracial murder. There's black people who kill white people who kill black people, etc. But generally, black people kill black people and white people kill white people. That's the reality of murder. And since white people kill white people, and white victims are more likely to be lead to a death sentence, that's why whites make up a majority of people that we see being executed. Okay. Now, in terms of the interracial stuff, we see some troubling numbers. 295 people, African American, who killed whites have been executed since 1976. 295 black people who killed white people have been executed. Only 21 white people who killed black people. So we've killed more black people who killed whites 13 to 14 times more than whites who killed blacks. I don't know what that means, but it suggests some kind of bias potentially. There's some examples throughout your slideshow from Georgia, Texas, Maryland, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Washington, and then North Carolina. Now the North Carolina ones are summarized by me in my research report, which is linked in slide number 46 of this PowerPoint slideshow. You can read the studies in North Carolina, okay? The American Bar Association studied this in 8 states. This is legal, non-political, non-biased organization. And they found evidence of race of victim bias in all of these states. The U.S. General Accounting Office studied it. They studied 28 studies. They reviewed 28 studies by 21 sets of researchers with 23 different data sets. And they found, quote, a pattern of evidence indicating racial disparities in the charging, sentencing, and imposition of the death penalty since 1976. Okay. In 82% of the studies, race of victims was found to influence the likelihood of being charged. Race of victim influence is found at all stages of the criminal justice system, even after controlling for legally relevant variables. That means it's not the law that explains these differences, it's race of victim. Okay. An update of the study found that 93% of states with data show evidence of race of victim bias. So in other words, this is the type of bias we have in death penalty cases. It's based on race of victim. Now, I mentioned Frank Baumgartner. You can Google this, look him up in North Carolina. He's done some really good stuff on this. He shows you the likelihood of getting a death sentence if you kill a white female, the likelihood of getting a death sentence if you kill a white male, the likelihood of getting a death sentence if you kill a black female, the likelihood of getting a death sentence if you kill a black male. It's almost reserved for killers of white females, honestly. But if you kill white people, you're more likely to get a death sentence. If you kill a black male, you're least likely to. Okay. Now, some of this disparity could come from prosecutorial discretion. Remember, the prosecutors are the ones that have to decide whether they seek the death penalty or not. So it's solely up to them. Well, 95% of elected prosecutors in death penalty states are white. So just logically, if you're a white person and you hang out with white people and you work with white people in the court, then maybe a white victim is going to be worth more to you. I hope that's not true, but you might identify with that victim more, or you might get more pressure, more support from their family. But for whatever reason, the prosecutors are seeking the death penalty more in these kinds of cases. Okay. Now, there's some discussion about types of discrimination. These disparities are not necessarily proof of discrimination, right? It raises the possibility of it, but doesn't prove it. That's something you have to decide for yourself going forward. But we do know that the death penalty is plagued by numerous disparities or differences. Discrimination is what's necessary to be unconstitutional, according to the McCleskey versus Kemp case that you guys looked at. The most likely forms of discrimination are the ones that are built into the law, and that's called institutional discrimination. And contextual, which means discrimination that's only found in some places sometimes. So there might be some prosecutors that are racially biased, but others that are not. Those are the most likely ones to be found. Now, the major scholars of race and crime and justice in the United States, Walker, Spohn, and DeLone, in their book, The Color of Justice, they actually argue that the death penalty is systematically racist. And they say that because it's biased at all stages against blacks, and it's been that way since the beginning of the country. They looked at it over time, but that's a matter of debate. Now, in terms of gender, well, we don't have measures of gender when it comes to this. We have measures of sex, biological sex. Women make up 10% of murder convictions. So they're committing about 10% of murder. But only 2% of death sentences, only 2% of people on death row, only 1% of people executed. What does that mean? Is it possible that we're soft on crime when it comes to women? Is it possible there's a bias in the death penalty against men? To my knowledge, no one's ever actually argued that to a court. That would be interesting. I asked the experts this. Is American capital punishment plagued by a gender or sex bias of any kind? Only 50% said yes. Okay. Most were, not most, a large portion, 38%, were unsure. This is not widely studied. I only know one person who studies this, and so I've relied on that research. But here's what some of them said, what some of the experts said. Defendants are more likely to be executed if they killed female victims. Next expert. Killers of female victims are more likely to receive the death penalty. Okay. American capital punishment is reserved almost exclusively for males. Okay. On and on and on. Women are disproportionately treated with mercy. Maybe we're more compassionate towards females. Men are disproportionately violentized. We are more violent and locked into using violence. Women still are not perceived as violent as men. So maybe juries are also less likely to seek or impose the death penalty because they view a woman as less likely to committing another murder. Okay, these are some people trying to be funny experts. Who wants to kill a woman? We seem to be remarkably squeamish when it comes to executing women. We seem to have difficulty bringing ourselves to execute mothers. Okay, and then on and on and on. White and female victims are singled out. The chivalry hypothesis is noted by one scholar. This is like being chivalrous means being nicer to women. So, for example, mothers who kill their children, um, there's a chivalry allegedly by one scholar. They're less likely to get a death sentence. But a lot of even though some experts talked about chivalry, most of the experts just talked about the fact that men commit the vast majority of murder. So you'd expect them to be the vast majority of death row and the vast majority of executions. Now, if you're interested in that, you took the theories of crime class with somebody, or criminology, you know that there's biological reasons why men are more violent, and there's social reasons, right? So higher levels of testosterone than women, and raised to be aggressive by parents or society. These are reasons why men are more violent, right? Now, innocence is the big one, okay? The final issue of innocence. If you support the death penalty and you knew that we were killing innocent people, would you still support it? Most people say no, I think. But there are even some of these scholars like Louis Poggeman who said innocent people being executed is just part of the cost of justice. And he actually wrote something pretty fascinating. He said, when a fire truck is called to fight a fire, sometimes, every once in a while, when it's rolling through an intersection or whatever, it kills an innocent civilian who didn't get out of the way. But we keep fighting fires. He said, so this is why we keep executing people, because even though we might occasionally kill an innocent person, we have to keep fighting the fire. We have to keep fighting murder. Interesting. But of course, fighting a fire is different than intentionally killing somebody, right? Fighting a fire is different than intentionally executing somebody. So maybe that's not as on point as he hoped. So I asked the experts, if American capital punishment ever used against the innocent? 76% said yes. Okay. Now 22% were unsure. That's because we don't have much evidence recently of an innocent person being executed, but there is evidence. And I can give you the names, for example. Look up Cameron Todd Willingham. Cameron Todd Willingham in the state of Texas. Pretty sure this guy was innocent and he was killed by the state of Texas. But a lot of the experts just talked about the past, that it was contaminated with gross error, that wrongful conviction occurs at about 5% of cases annually. Another expert says over 100 people have been set free from death row. Okay. Another points out the Innocent Project, who's eliminated this fact. Okay. Here's what other experts said: absolutely. Another one said absolutely. Another one said the evidence indicates it has been used against the innocent. This one's sort of dismissive. One expert said, sure, though I think we catch most of them before they're executed. Whew. Wow. It's been documented with reasonable certainty. Now, one person says there's no absolutely proven case of an innocent person being executed after Furman versus Georgia. Cameron Todd Williams. Another expert actually pointed out the Griffin case out of Missouri. That's what they wrote. Seems to be the most likely candidate at present. It's almost inevitable we will discover we have in fact executed innocent people, and I believe we've done that again, as I've said. And then a lot of the experts, when asked about innocence, just talked about the Death Penalty Information Center innocent lists, which you're supposed to look at in your readings. A good proportion of the people on the Death Penalty Information Center's list of innocence releases from prison are factually innocent. This has been shown over 122 times. Okay. On and on and on. Here's an expert who said this: I'm pretty sure there have been at least a few cases in which people who were executed were later absolutely proven to have been innocent. It happens in the movies. It seems reasonable that it also happens in reality, even excluding cases of lynching, which we know is used widespread against innocent people. Since I personally believe that this is what the expert said, Since I personally believe that capital punishment could be a strong deterrent to homicide, I don't have a major problem with erroneous application of capital punishment. In other words, if we're saving innocent life through the death penalty, then by preventing murder, then it might be okay to take innocent life with execution. And the person says, I would describe this possibility as no more than an imperfection. What's an imperfection? Imperfect system. Okay. There's a really long answer about how, slide number 79, how it's used against the innocent in a couple of ways. You can check that out. This is someone who put a lot of time into their answer. Now, the people that said no said there's no evidence that convinces me that the death penalty has executed an innocent person. Maybe, but not convincing proof. Another one says no, or perhaps, but we've come too close. Another one says probably not. Okay. Others say we know they're sentenced to die. We don't know if they're executed. Right? Wow, some people, some people challenge the question wording, but that happens. I'm not worried about it. Now, remember North Carolina, which we looked at before. Now, this is old North Carolina, 1910 to 1961. 87% of the people we executed for rape were black men, and 100% of the people we executed for burglary are black men. Well, we know that there's serious problems with eyewitness identification in these types of crimes, and especially in the South, when you have people being falsely accused. So it's likely, without any doubt, that North Carolina used to be executing innocent people. But are they doing it now? Well, we've at least come close. Okay, we know 7 cases were death penalty cases were involved with faulty blood evidence from the North Carolina Crime Lab, where people were convicted based on faulty blood evidence. 3 of those have been executed. Now, we don't know that they were innocent, but we know that there were at least serious problems with their cases. And we know that North Carolina ranks up there in terms of the number of people released from death row. You can look at the numbers on the Death Penalty Information Center website. Okay. Now, when you look at that website, what you're looking at is people who've been found legally innocent. Doesn't mean they're factually innocent, okay? But it also does not include the ones who are probably innocent and possibly innocent. Those are separate lists, okay? And then there's people who are executed despite doubts about their guess. Or about their guilt. You have to decide for yourself whether you think they're actually innocent, okay? The largest study was from 30 years of research, and it found 496 wrongly convicted people sentenced to death. That was 1992 with follow-ups. 23 of those were executed, okay? 22 were freed within 3 days of their execution. 84% of the convictions occurred prior to 1976, so that means super due process might be working better, okay? But 96% of the wrongful executions also occurred prior to 1976. I don't know why I said but. Same thing. So super due process is apparently making this less common. That's good. Now, Robert Boehm says 16 wrongful executions since 1976, or 2% of the total. This is one expert's opinion. Okay. Now, look at the cases on slide 88 in the Death Penalty Information Center. Look at the innocent people who've been executed since 1976, and you decide for yourself if they're innocent. Now, there's no way you can know, but some of those cases really seem like it at the very least. Okay. We discover about 5 wrongful convictions every year, people who are sentenced to death. Okay. 5 of the last 32 are from the state of North Carolina. Just saying. Now, are those mistakes or are they successes? In other words, we caught them, so is that a success or is it a mistake? Some people argue the death penalty is broken. You can read these studies. Part 1 has the facts, Part 2 has the explanation. Okay. The broken system report is a review of all death penalty appeals over a very long period of time. And what they found is 2 out of every 3 death sentences are overturned on appeal. 2 out of every 3. This is because they're due to some major constitutional error in their trial or what have you, or sentencing. In North Carolina, it's 2 out of 3 death sentences are overturned on appeal. That doesn't mean they're innocent, but I mean some of them probably are. Okay. So we know the bottom line is that the death penalty is plagued by the threat of executing innocent. We know we also continue to convict wrongly people and sentence them to death. Studies show the more likely we do it, the more likely we are to make mistakes. And the less we allow people to appeal, the less likely we are to find it. This is what we find from the actual study. So, given that, how do you feel about the death penalty? Now, you have to decide for yourself. This class is not about your opinion, right? You're not being graded based on that. It's based on whether you understand it. But there's significant evidence of major problems with the death penalty, including the threat to the innocent. So you have to ask yourself again, as I mentioned on a previous video, take the meager benefits of a little retribution, a little incapacitation, maybe a little deterrence, and you put that on a scale and you weigh it against racial bias and innocence and financial costs and things like that, you can see why a lot of experts think the costs outweigh the benefits, as well as people in society or politicians. This might be a reason to be opposed to the death penalty, but not necessarily. Maybe you're willing to tolerate that. That's up to you, and you can vote your conscience. All right. Let me know if you have questions. There's a lot of information here. You have a lot of readings to do. So let me know if you have questions. I'm happy to Zoom with you as well to give you more information. Good luck, and I'll talk to you soon.